All right, so we're picking up today talking about the ways that we assess intelligence and some of the history behind the assessment of our intelligence. So anytime we're referring to assessment, we're referring to to the activity and instruments used to measure intelligence. And this has changed a lot over the years. Now, in class, we've kind of been looking at we've seen some different ways and some different methods. We watched the Battle of the Brains and we saw that there's the creative tests and the practical tests. And then we took some of those. We looked at some of the WAIS tests, so you can kind of see that there's different ways to assess intelligence besides just the strict multiple choice type test. Now, the challenge with any intelligence assessment is to make these tests both valid and reliable. So these are two terms that you definitely need to make sure that you know and understand. A valid test means that it measures what it is supposed to measure, and a reliable test means that it yields the same score if administered again, even if it's administered by somebody else. So for instance, those 1-minute intelligence tests that we took in class, with the inside story. Now, those are very reliable because I've been giving them for 11 years, and every year I give them, it administers the same score. Kids do better on the first one, about 6 to 8, and worse on the second one, about 3 to 4. Okay, so it's very reliable. I can definitely say it's a reliable test. However, it's not a very valid test because it's not measuring intelligence like I made it seem like. It's measuring speed, ability to read, how fast you could write, knowledge of, kind of little phrases. So it's not valid. So when you are creating an intelligence test, okay, or even taking an intelligence test, you always want to look at both the validity and the reliability. So why should we even try to measure intelligence? Well, we study how and why people differ in ability, trying to understand where these differences come. Why are some people better and some people worse at different things? To match strengths and weaknesses to jobs and school programs. Well, obviously, what your abilities are important when we're trying to figure out jobs, when we're trying to figure out what courses you should take in school. If you are not a math person, and some people are just not math people, you should not be taking advanced math classes, right? But same with science. If you're totally passionate about science and you love the way things work, then yes, you should take science classes. So assessing intelligence, looking in a well-rounded picture obviously can help us. Now, history of assessing intelligence it helped with this survival of the fittest process, trying to select the people who have the greatest abilities. And this was the position of eugenist Francis Galton, or eugenicist. So the eugenics movement, which we kind of talked about in class, was this idea that we should use this natural selection, and through breeding, we should try to eliminate certain aspects or certain traits in our society. So for instance, criminals and low mental aptitude, we try to kind of, through forced sterilization, through, and those kinds of methods, prevent them from reproducing, thus preventing those traits, those genes from being passed down. And this was actually, the Supreme Court even passed laws in Virginia allowing people to forcibly sterilize people who met certain criteria. Again, criminals, people with low IQs who were tested with low IQs, to prevent those genes from being passed down. And society embraced this because it was supposed to be building and helping our society prosper. Now, obviously, it never really made its way to where we were supposed to, because we did start to realize that this was not a healthy thing and this was not a good thing for our society. But for a while, it really was it is part of our history. So when did using intelligence start? Well, it started with a guy named Alfred Binet, and the problem he was kind of using to come up with this was, in the late 1800s, a new law in France required universal education even for those without the ability to succeed in the current instruction. So Binet's solution was he was going to devise tests for children to determine which ones needed help. And he hoped to predict a child's level of success in regular education. Okay, so he's the one that came up with what he called mental age, which is how far a child had come along on the normal developmental pathway. Okay, so versus your chronological age, which is how old you are, just timeline-wise, age-wise. So some of the problems with his thing is that he assumed that all children follow the same course of development, but somewhat more quickly and somewhat less, which he kind of, some children do develop more quickly and some develop a little bit slower, which he kind of failed to account for. So even though, some children were technically testing less than, it really was just because developmentally they were a little slower. It wasn't that they were never going to catch all the way up, it's just that at that point they hadn't. The implication was that children with lower ability were delayed and not disabled, and with help that they could improve. So that's kind of where what his idea was that, okay, we need to look at the big picture. We need to give them a test. We need to say what kind of schooling do they need. We need to say what, how could we help them? How could we get them through? Not just shove them kind of in the closet and say, okay, you're never going to, let's not deal with you. He kind of wanted to revamp the testing system to try to see if he could help people. So what did the scores mean? Well, Louis Terman of Stanford University began with a different assumption than Binet. Terman felt that intelligence was unchanging and innate, or genetic. So while Binet kind of said, hey, even if they are a little bit delayed, let's work with them, let's help them, Terman kind of felt like, I don't know if there's a lot we could do. However, later, Terman saw how scores can be affected by people's level of education and their familiarity with the language and the culture used in the test. So he started then to kind of realize that maybe there's more factors beyond genetics that played a role. So now, what do you do if you score low on an IQ test? Well, Binet said you should study, develop self-discipline and an attention span, and Terman said remove your genes from the population. So Terman was a eugenicist. He believed that no, we just need to remove you all the way from it. So later then, a guy named William Stern came around. Okay, and William Stern is the one that actually developed this whole IQ that we use today, which is mental age over chronological age times 100. So for instance, going back using what Binet had talked about with this idea of your mental age, is what your score is on this test. So, and how the test is put together is, okay, well, these are the things that we think a X number-year-old should be able to do. And so they give you the test, and how far you can go kind of gives you what we call your mental age. And then over your chronological age, which is just your birth date, times 100, and that gives you your traditional IQ score. So different kinds of tests are used, though. We have these aptitude tests versus achievement tests. What is an aptitude test? Well, an aptitude test is a test that measures what you have already learned. So, for instance, an achievement test. I was reading backwards. Achievement tests measure what you have already learned. Okay, for instance, literary tests, driver's license exam, a final exam in your psychology course, the STAR tests. These are tests of what you have learned. Okay, aptitude tests attempt to predict your ability to learn new skills. So the SAT, for instance, is an aptitude test because it's trying to see how well are you going to do later in life. How well can you learn, basically. The SAT, the ACT, the GRE are all supposed to predict your ability to do well in future academic work, which is why colleges look at them, is because they want you to prosper at their universities. So, if the SAT is an aptitude test, should it correlate with IQ? Well, what we find is that there is a positive correlation between SAT scores and your IQ. People with higher SAT scores do tend to have higher IQs. Now, notice that this is the old SAT chart. Okay, 1600, like when I took the test, 1600 was the highest, was a perfect score. They've revamped it since then, and I don't know if they've done any new studies in terms with IQ scores and SAT scores, only because we are starting to move away from this idea of an IQ score because of, like we talked about, what does it really mean? There's all kinds of other different measures of intelligence. So the Wechsler's test, the one we talked about, is kind of the current standard for intelligence testing. Okay, so the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, WAIS, and the Wechsler Children's Scale for Intelligence, WISC, measure both G and IQ, meaning that they're both this little underlying underlying measure, but you also measure IQ. So you get both. You kind of get both scores. Okay, and then you also get sub-scores for verbal comprehension, processing speed, perceptual organization, and working memory. So it does take into consideration this idea of multiple intelligences. It takes into consideration this base level. Okay, it takes into consideration an IQ. So we get a number to kind of give you to compare you to other people. Okay, but then you also get subscores. So you can kind of find out where maybe your abilities lie. You know, is it verbal? Is it processing? Is it perceptual? Is it working memory? And also, if you have any deficiencies, we can kind of identify where those deficiencies are, and maybe you'll score higher if we can give you some tools to overcome some of these deficiencies. Now, every generation, you know, we talked about the Flynn effect and how the Flynn effect has to do with this idea of you have to reevaluate. Oh, my child is coming to talk to us. Hold on. Hunter, say hi. Say hi. The Flynn effect, where, you know, we're getting smarter in every generation. Well, one of the things that we have to do because of this is that we have to restandardize. So we have to retest a sample of the general population to make an updated, accurate comparison group. Okay, so because people are getting higher, we realize that, you know, as a group, we're getting smarter. So we have to figure out who are the smarter of the new smart people. So we have to always consistently restandardize our tests. All right, so we're going to end here this time, and then we're going to pick up looking at some of the different dynamics of intelligence. Hunter, say bye-bye.